Bordeaux, 1947. A crimson-sealed invitation lures Miss Jane Marple to the forgotten Château Valrose, where a bankrupt colonel guards a legendary vintage bricked up since the occupation. Within 48 hours, a wine merchant lies stabbed among the vines, digitalis foaming in a widow's glass, a cellar wall hiding Algerian plonk behind priceless labels. A violet-eyed heiress, a sleek lawyer, a nerve doctor with trembling hands, and an ancient vigneron who swears the vines remember blood, every one of them poised above a fortune. In 7 razor-sharp chapters, the quiet old lady from Much Benham unravels spring-loaded knives, forged telegrams, and midnight substitutions to reveal not one murderer, but 2. Stay for the click of knitting needles that stitches greed to the final cork. Chapter 1, The Invitation. The postman in Much Benham was a creature of habit. He delivered the second post at 23 minutes past 11, rain or shine. On this particular Tuesday in October, the rain had been shining steadily since dawn, and Miss Jane Marple, having finished her modest breakfast of toast and Cooper's Oxford marmalade, was engaged in the gentle domestic tyranny of darning a heel in one of her own lisle stockings, when the knocker sounded its familiar rat-tat. Mrs. Potter, who did for Miss Marple 3 mornings a week and all day Thursday, admitted the dripping postman with the air of one performing a sacred rite. A single letter lay on the salver, thick cream paper, the flap secured by a blob of crimson sealing wax impressed with a vine-wreathed tower. The handwriting on the envelope was firm, military, the address Miss J. Marple, Danemead Cottage, High Street, Much Benham, set down with the precision of a man accustomed to giving orders that were obeyed. Miss Marple laid aside needle and wool, wiped marmalade from her fingers with a corner of the table napkin, and slit the envelope with the butter knife. The notepaper within carried the same crest, now embossed in gold. My dear Miss Marple, Château Valrose has lain silent since the war, the vines abandoned to bramble and memory. I open it for 1 week only, to taste the 47 before the bulldozers come. Come, bring your knitting and that disconcertingly clear sight of yours. Someone here will need it before the week is out. Yours ever, Lucian Bantry, Colonel Retted. Miss Marple folded the letter with care and placed it beside her plate. Colonel Bantry. She remembered him well from the days when Dolly Bantry had ruled the manor at St. Mary Mead with a mixture of charm and autocracy. The colonel had been a spare, sunburnt man then, always just back from some outpost of empire, always just living again. Dolly's death had finished him for England. He had sold up and vanished abroad. Bordeaux, it seemed, had claimed him. She rose, crossed to the window, and looked out upon the sodden garden. The Michaelmas daisies drooped like repentant sinners. The last rose of summer had surrendered its petals to the wind. Travel, at her age, was not to be undertaken lightly. Yet the phrase, "someone here will need it," had the authentic ring of a cry for help. Miss Marple recognized the note. She had heard it often in village drawing rooms, where Mrs. Price Ridley suspected the grocer of short weight, or when the choir boy's mother feared her son was walking out with the wrong sort of girl. Murder, of course, was only an extreme form of village trouble. By luncheon, she had decided. She telephoned the vicar's wife, who promised to feed the goldfish and take in the milk. She informed Mrs. Potter, who received the news with the resigned stoicism of one who had seen her employer vanish to Scotland Yard on more than one occasion. She packed one modest suitcase and her knitting bag, beige wool, 4-ply, intended for socks for the Belgian refugees. The cross-channel steamer from Dover left at an uncivilized hour, but the sea was kind, the cabin stuffy with the smell of cabbage and hot oil. Miss Marple slept better than she had expected, lulled by the thump of engines and the knowledge that human nature, whether in Much Benham or the Medoc, obeyed the same tiresome laws. At Calais, a thin youth in a beret too large for him was waiting with a hand-lettered card, Miss Marple. The Citroën provided by the Colonel was elderly, smelling of petrol and Gauloises, and the boy drove as though pursued by the entire German army. They left the main road south of Poitiers and plunged into a labyrinth of lanes where the plane trees met overhead like the vaulting of a green cathedral. Dusk was thickening when they turned between gateposts from which the ironwork had long since been requisitioned for the war effort. The drive climbed through neglected parkland. Rabbits scuttled across the gravel. Then the chateau appeared, crouched upon its knoll like a broody hen. Pepperpot towers, windows blind with shutters, a tangle of ivy strangling the stone. Behind it, the vineyard sloped to the river in ragged terraces, the vines unpruned, silvered by the last light. Colonel Bantry was waiting on the front steps, thinner than she remembered, the moustache yellowed by nicotine, the eyes still the faded blue of desert skies. He took both her hands in his. "Jane, you angel! I swore I'd never ask another favour after Dolly made me dance at that ghastly bazaar in '38, but here you are." "One does what one can," said Miss Marple mildly. "Though I hope the emergency is not too pressing. The French police, I believe, are remarkably efficient." The Colonel's laugh was short. "Cruchot of the Bordeaux Brigade is a martinet with a moustache like a yard brush, but he's in Bordeaux, and the thing hasn't happened yet." He led her through a vaulted hall, where suits of armour stood in attitudes of perpetual astonishment, and up a staircase that creaked like a guilty conscience. Her room overlooked the west vineyard. A fire of vine cuttings crackled in the grate. On the bed lay a hot water bottle wrapped in a cashmere shawl. "Dinner at 8, the Colonel said. "Nothing formal, just a house party, and a spot of the 61 to take the chill off. You'll meet them all then." Left alone, Miss Marple unpacked with methodical care. 2 cardigans, 3 pairs of stockings, the beige knitting, and because one never knew, a small leather-bound notebook and a propelling pencil. She opened the shutters. Below her the vineyard lay in darkness. But a single lamp moved steadily between the rows, someone testing the soil, perhaps, or counting the ghosts of harvests past. She closed the shutters, drew the curtains and sat down to knit. The pattern was simple, but human beings, she reflected, seldom were. Chapter 2. The Household. The gong for dinner at Chateau Valrose was a cracked bronze disc that had once summoned the retainers of a ducal house in the reign of Louis Philippe. It gave forth a sound less musical than mournful, as though it regretted the grandeur it had lost. Miss Marple, descending the staircase at 2 minutes before the hour, found the hall already populous with shadows and with people. Colonel Bantry, resplendent in a dinner jacket that had seen better decades, stood beneath the chandelier polishing a monocle that he no longer wore. He offered Miss Marple his arm with the air of a man presenting a trophy. "Allow me to perform the introductions, Jane. I warn you, we are a scratch lot, but the wine is honest and the murders, well, we hope there will be none." He steered her toward the fireplace, where a log of vine roots spat and hissed like an angry cat. A girl rose from the tapestried settle, tall, black-haired, with the sort of violet eyes that poets exhaust themselves describing. She wore mourning, but the black silk was Paris cut, and the grief in her face was tempered by calculation. "Cécile Valrose," said the colonel, "my ward and the owner of all this melancholy magnificence. Cécile, Miss Marple is the lady who once proved that the verger's wife was poisoning the communion wine with weed-killer." "Only a suspicion, Colonel," Miss Marple corrected gently, "and quite unfounded, as it turned out. The taste was merely the new altar vintage." Cecilia inclined her head with the grace of a duchess receiving a curtsy. "Enchanted, mademoiselle. My guardian says you see through brick walls." "Only through pretense, my dear. Brick is opaque." A man detached himself from the shadows beside the suit of armour, sleek, dark, with the unctuous smile of the legal profession. His evening clothes were too new, his cuffs too stiff. "Monsieur Armand Leclerc, of Leclerc, Dupont et Fils, Bordeaux. He keeps the deeds in order, and the heirs in ignorance." The colonel's tone was dry. Leclerc bowed over Miss Marple's hand, leaving upon it the faint scent of brilliantine and the Rue de la Paix. "The estate is complicated, madame. Entails, war, damage, death duties. But all is in order for Mademoiselle Cécile's majority next month." His eyes, small and black as currants, flicked to the girl and away again. Miss Marple noted the flicker. From the doorway came a rustle of taffeta and a gust of l'heure bleue. Mrs. Lavinia Bryce was large, lavishly corseted, and adorned with rings that flashed like semaphore flags. Her voice preceded her by 3 paces. "Colonel, you wicked man, you promised me civilized company, and here is a perfect dear in lavender knit." "Miss Marple, I knew your nephew Raymond. He wrote those dreadfully clever novels about unhappy marriages. I am Mrs. Bryce, widow of Bryce's Biscuits, the ones with the dolphin on the tin. I am staying a fortnight to forget my sciatica and remember my youth." She sank into a chair that groaned in protest and fanned herself with a menu card. A thin man in a charcoal suit unfolded himself from the window seat. His hair was slicked back with water. His fingers twitched as though seeking a hypodermic. "Dr. Félix Moreau," said the colonel, "nerve specialist from the Salpêtrière. He is here to pronounce the chateau haunted and prescribe bromide for us all." Moreau's smile was professional, chilly. "The house is certainly neurotic, Colonel. Dry rot in the soul, but I confine myself to live in patience." The door to the servants' passage opened, and Pierre entered, bearing a silver tray of cocktails. He was old, 70 perhaps, with the bowed legs of a lifetime among vines, and the face of a gargoyle carved by wind and sun. His eyes, pale blue and unblinking, rested on each guest in turn, as though measuring them for coffins. He served in silence, the tray steady despite the tremor in his wrists. "Pierre has been here since the vintage of '95, the colonel explained. "He knows where the bodies are buried, literally, in some cases. The Germans use the cellars." Pierre's mouth twitched. "The vines remember, mon colonel. They drink deep." The final guest arrived late, erupting through the double doors in a gale of laughter and expensive tweed. Gervais Page was pink, plump, and improbably youthful, with a handshake like a leg of mutton, and a voice that filled the hall. "Fearfully sorry, everybody. Train held up at Libourne. Some nonsense about a cow on the line. Page is the name. Wine trade. Bond Street. "Colonel, you old rogue, you promised me the 47 and I've come to collect." He seized Miss Marple's hand and pumped it until her knitting needles rattled in her bag. "Delighted, Mum. You must be the famous aunt who solves mysteries between the roses." Miss Marple retrieved her hand and smiled the small, polite smile that had quelled curates and chief constables alike. "I observe, Mr. Page. That is all." The gong sounded again, more peremptory. They processed into the dining room, a vaulted chamber where the table was laid for 8 beneath a fresco of Bacchus, so blackened by echo, centuries of wood smoke that the god appeared to be wearing mourning. The silver was tarnished, the damask patched, but the glasses, oh, the glasses were perfection, thin as eggshell, bearing the crest of Valrose. Pierre served a consommé the colour of amber, followed by trout from the river grilled with almonds. The wine was a 61 Chateau Margaux, decanted with reverence. Conversation, lubricated, began to flow. Mrs. Bryce, between spoonfuls, catalogued the misfortunes of her acquaintances in Tunbridge Wells. Dr. Moreau dissected the neuroses of the modern heiress. Leclerc murmured of death duties and the necessity of prudent investment. Cécile said little, but her eyes moved continually from face to face as though memorizing a script. Gervase Page dominated the table with tales of auctions at Christie's, and the American millionaire who had paid 500 guineas for a single bottle of 21 Weequem, only to discover it was vinegar. "Serves him right," he boomed. "The label was a forgery. Child's play to spot if you know your typography. The apostrophe in 21 was wrong." Colonel Bantry refilled glasses. "Tomorrow we open the West Cave. The 47 has slept since the occupation. Pierre bricked it up himself the night the Germans marched in. We'll taste it at sunset, provided the bulldozers keep their distance." Pierre, clearing plates, muttered something about the vines not liking to be disturbed. After the entrée, pigeon in a sauce of morels, Miss Marple found herself seated between Dr. Moreau and Monsieur Leclerc. The doctor spoke of digitalis and its effect upon the heart. The lawyer countered with the effect of inheritance tax upon the estate. Their voices were low, but Miss Marple's ears were sharp. "Moreau, the girl is highly strung. A shock could precipitate a crisis." Leclerc, "A crisis can be managed, provided the documents are in order." Cécile, at the far end, laughed at something Page whispered. The laugh was bright, artificial, the sort of laugh that covers fear. Coffee was served in the petit salon, a room panelled in worm-eaten oak and furnished with chairs that looked as though they had been designed for the Inquisition. A pianola in the corner wheezed through a selection from The Merry Widow. Mrs. Bryce declared her intention of retiring early. French mattresses are murder on the spine, and swept upstairs trailing scarves. Dr. Moreau excused himself to check the barometer. Leclerc vanished in the direction of the library, murmuring about papers. Page proposed brandy on the terrace. The colonel, pleading a touch of malaria, retired to his study. Cécile lingered by the pianola, winding the handle with mechanical precision. Miss Marple, left with Pierre clearing the cups, asked mildly, "Do the vines truly remember, monsieur?" Pierre's old eyes fixed upon her. "They remember drought, frost, the boots of soldiers, and blood, mademoiselle. Blood feeds the root." He gathered the tray and shuffled out, leaving her alone with the wheezing pianola and the scent of cold coffee. Upstairs, in the room prepared for her, Miss Marple opened her notebook and wrote in her neat, spinsterish hand, "Household, 8 souls, counting Pierre. Motives, money, fear, love. Observe, the lawyer's cuffs, the doctor's tremor, the heiress's laugh." She underlined the last phrase twice, closed the book, and placed it beneath her pillow, beside the beige knitting. Outside, the vineyard lay black and silent under a sky pricked with indifferent stars. Somewhere, an owl called, and far below, in the cellars, a bottle shifted in its sleep. Chapter 3. The First Whisper. Miss Marple slept lightly, as was her habit in unfamiliar beds. The chateau's silence was not the companionable hush of Danmead Cottage, but a watchful stillness, as though the stones themselves were holding their breath. At 12:30 she rose, slipped her feet into felt slippers, and drew on a woolen dressing-gown the colour of weak tea. The house was dark, the corridors lit only by the occasional flicker of a dying candle in a wall sconce. She had intended merely to fetch a glass of water from the bathroom at the end of the passage, but the sound stopped her. A soft, deliberate footfall on the gravel beneath her window. She parted the heavy brocade curtains and looked down. The courtyard was a pool of ink, but a figure moved across it. Tall, cloaked, the hood drawn up. The cloak was dark, indistinguishable from the night, yet the movement was purposeful. The figure crossed to the iron-bound door that led to the cellars, produced a key, and vanished inside. The door closed with the faintest click. Miss Marple waited. 1 minute, 2. No light showed beneath the door. She closed the curtains, returned to bed, and lay listening. At length the house settled again into its uneasy slumber. Breakfast was served in the morning room, a chamber that smelled of damp plaster and coffee. The party assembled piecemeal. Colonel Bantry was already at the table, attacking a plate of eggs with the concentration of a man who has decided to ignore the night. Cécile appeared in a charcoal sweater and skirt, her face pale, the violet eyes shadowed. She drank coffee black and refused food. Mrs. Bryce descended like a galleon under full sail, complaining that the hot water bottle had been stone cold by 3. Dr. Moreau followed, carrying a small leather case. He opened it to reveal a row of ampules and selected one with the care of a jeweller choosing a stone. Gervais Page was last, humming La Vie en Rose off-key and helping himself to 3 croissants. Pierre served in silence, his old eyes flicking from face to face. When he placed the coffee pot before Miss Marple, his hand trembled. A drop fell upon the cloth. "Forgive me, mademoiselle," he muttered. "The night was long." Miss Marple smiled. "The vines kept you busy, I expect." He gave her a sharp look and withdrew. Conversation was desultory. The colonel announced that the west cave would be opened at 5. Pierre had already removed the bricks. Page rubbed his hands. "Historic moment, what? 47, legendary vintage. If it's half what they say, I'll buy the lot." Leclerc, buttering toast with precision, remarked that the lot belonged to Mademoiselle Cécile. Page laughed too loudly. After breakfast, the party dispersed. Mrs. Bryce declared her intention of writing letters in the library. Dr. Moreau vanished with his case. Cécile went to the music room and began to play Chopin with more force than feeling. The colonel took Page to inspect the cellars. Miss Marple, pleading a wish to see the gardens, put on her stout walking shoes and a sensible tweed coat and set out alone. The vineyard began immediately beyond the terrace, descending in uneven terraces to the river. The vines were old, gnarled, the leaves turning bronze and crimson. No pruning had been done for years. Suckers shot up like green fountains. The air smelled of lift mould and distant wood smoke. She walked slowly, noting details as was her habit. Halfway down the slope, she paused. A single row had been cleared of weeds. The soil was freshly turned. Beside it lay a heap of cuttings, and among them a pruning knife with a new blade still bright. Someone had been at work since dawn. She bent to examine the knife. The handle was of pale wood, the sort sold in Bordeaux shops for 2 francs. There were no fingerprints visible, but a smear of sap clung to the blade. She left it where it lay and continued downward. At the bottom of the slope, a path ran along the river bank, overhung by willows. Here foxgloves grew in profusion, their bells heavy with seed. Miss Marple stooped, pinched a leaf, and slipped it into her pocket. The plant was Digitalis purpurea. She'd seen its effects before, in the case of old Miss Lamprey's heart tonic. On the return journey she met Pierre. He was carrying a basket of grapes, black and dusty with bloom. "Good morning, monsieur. You are early at your labours." "The vines do not wait, mademoiselle." He set down the basket. "You walk alone?" "I find solitude instructive." He glanced toward the cleared row. "Someone walked before you. The earth is soft." "Indeed, and someone entered the cellars last night. I saw the cloak." Pierre's face did not change, but his fingers tightened on the basket handle. "Many cloaks in the house. The night is cold." He lifted the basket and moved on. Miss Marple watched him go, then climbed the terrace steps. Luncheon was a scratch meal of cold pigeon and salad. Mrs. Bryce dominated the table with an account of a burglary at her villa in Cannes. "The insolence of it! They took my diamond brooch and left the paste copy in its place. The police were hopeless." Page suggested that the thief had taste. Mrs. Bryce bridled. Dr. Moreau remarked that substitution was a common neurotic symptom. Cécile pushed her plate away untouched. After the meal, Miss Marple retired to her room. She opened her notebook and added, "Cloaked figure, cellar's midnight, pruning knife, new sap, foxgloves, river path. Pierre knows more than he says." She underlined the last line, then took up her knitting. The beige sock grew steadily. So did her certainty that the pattern was forming. At 4 o'clock the sky darkened and a wind rose, rattling the shutters. The party gathered in the hall. Pierre appeared, his sleeves rolled, his hands stained purple. "The cave is open, mon colonel. The bottles sleep still." They descended in procession. The colonel with an electric torch, Page with a notebook, Leclerc with a fountain pen poised like a weapon. Cécile hung back. Dr. Moreau supported her elbow. Mrs. Bryce brought up the rear, complaining of the damp. The cellar was vast, vaulted, the air cool and fragrant with the breath of old wine. Rows of bottles lay in wooden racks, cobwebs veiling the labels. Pierre moved ahead, counting under his breath. At the far end, a section of wall had been bricked up. The bricks lay in a neat pile, the mortar still pale. Behind the wall lay a smaller chamber. 12 bottles stood in a single rack, each swathed in straw. The labels were handwritten. Chateau Valrose, 1947. Page gave a low whistle. Magnificent, not a cork displaced. The colonel lifted one bottle reverently. "We'll taste it upstairs at sunset. Pierre, bring the glasses." As they turned to leave, Miss Marple lingered. In the dust of the floor, she saw footprints. Small, neat, the mark of a woman's shoe. They led to the rack and away again. Someone had been here before the bricks came down. Upstairs the storm broke. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolled over the vineyard like artillery. The tasting was postponed until the weather cleared. At 6, Mrs. Bryce retired to dress. Miss Marple, passing her door, heard voices within, Mrs. Bryce's, sharp, and another lower, urgent. The door was ajar. She caught a glimpse of Cecile, white-faced, twisting a handkerchief. "Must tell him tonight, or it will be too late." The door closed. Miss Marple continued to her room. At 7, the storm abated. The party reassembled in the petit salon. Pierre had laid out the glasses, 8 of them, though only 7 would drink. The bottle stood on a silver tray, the cork already drawn. The Colonel poured. The wine was dark, almost black, with a scent of violets and earth. "To the 47, he said, raising his glass. They drank. Page rolled the wine on his tongue, eyes closed in ecstasy. "Perfection, black currant, truffle, a hint of leather, worth a king's ransom." Cecile sipped and set her glass down, untouched. Dr. Moreau watched her with clinical interest. Leclerc sniffed his bouquet like a suspicious dog. Mrs. Bryce drained her glass and held it out for more. "Delicious, though I prefer a nice sweet sauternes." Miss Marple tasted, then set her glass aside. The flavour was superb, but something else lay beneath it, a faint, acrid note, almost imperceptible. She looked at Pierre. His eyes were fixed on the bottle, unblinking. The second round was poured. Mrs. Bryce took a hearty swallow. Suddenly, she gasped. Her hand flew to her throat. The glass fell, shattering on the parquet. She staggered, face empurpling, and collapsed in a heap of taffeta and diamonds. Dr. Moreau knelt beside her, fingers at her neck. "Heart!" he said curtly. "Digitalis! Too late!" Chaos erupted. Cecile screamed. Page stood frozen, wine dripping from his glass. The Colonel shouted for brandy. Miss Marple alone remained calm. She picked up Mrs. Bryce's glass, sniffed the dregs, and looked at the bottle. A faint sediment lay at the bottom, colourless crystals already dissolving. She turned to Pierre. The substitution was made in the cellar before the bricks came down. Someone knew which bottle would be opened first. Pierre met her gaze. "The vines remember," he said again softly. "And so do I." Chapter 4. The body dawn came grey and reluctant, the sky the colour of wet slate. The storm had passed, leaving the vineyard sodden and the river swollen with ochre water. Colonel Bantry, his face the shade of old parchment, rapped on Miss Marple's door at 6:30. "Jane, it's worse than we thought. Gervais Page is dead, stabbed, in the West Vineyard." Miss Marple was already dressed, her grey hair pinned with precision, her notebook in her hand. "Show me," she said simply. They descended through the silent house. Pierre was in the kitchen, brewing coffee that smelled of chicory and despair. Cecile sat at the table, wrapped in a blanket, eyes red-rimmed. Dr. Moreau stood by the window, lighting one cigarette from the butt of another. Leclerc was absent. The body lay face down between 2 rows of the oldest vines, the pruning knife buried to the hilt between the shoulder blades. Page's pink face was now the colour of tallow. His eyes stared sightlessly at the sky. Rain had washed the blood into the soil, but a dark stain spread like a bruise beneath him. Colonel Bantry's voice shook. "He was alive at midnight. Shared a nightcap with me in the library. Said he wanted to see the vines by moonlight. Some nonsense about terroir. I told him to take a torch. He laughed and said he knew the way blindfold." Miss Marple knelt, heedless of the mud. The knife was the twin of the one she had seen yesterday. Blade bright, handle pale. The wound was neat, delivered with force by someone standing behind the victim. She noted the angle. The killer was taller than Page, or had struck downward. Footprints were everywhere, churned by the storm, but one set led away toward the river. Small, narrow, the heel mark of a woman's court shoe. They vanished at the path. Dr. Moreau arrived breathless. He examined the body with professional detachment. Death instantaneous, between 1 and 3 a.m. The blade severed the spinal cord. He straightened. I pronounced Mrs. Bryce at 7:30 last night. Digitalis poisoning, massive dose. Someone is very busy. Inspector Jean-Paul Cruchot of the Bordeaux police arrived at 9, driven by a sergeant who looked as though he regretted every kilometre. Cruchot was small, compact, with a moustache waxed to dagger points and eyes that missed nothing. He greeted the colonel with the weary courtesy of a man who has seen too many English country houses. 2 deaths in 12 hours, mon colonel. This is not coincidence. He surveyed the vineyard, the body, the knife. The weapon is new, purchased yesterday in Bordeaux. I have the receipt. He produced it from his pocket. 1 pruning knife, 2 francs, sold to Monsieur Gervais Page at 11:47 a.m. Page had bought his own murder weapon. The house was sealed. Cruchot established himself in the library, a room lined with calf-bound volumes no one had opened since the First Empire. He interviewed each guest in turn. Cécile wept prettily, said she had retired at 10 and slept heavily. Dr. Moreau confirmed he had given her a mild sedative. Leclerc produced a ledger showing he had worked until 2, then locked himself in his room. Mrs. Bryce's death had shocked him profoundly. Colonel Bantry admitted the nightcap with Page. He was excited about the 47, said he had a buyer in Chicago who would pay $20,000 for the dozen. I thought him optimistic. Pierre, summoned last, stood before the inspector like an ancient oak. I was in the vines at dawn. I found the Englishman. The knife was already in his back. Cruchot dismissed him with a flick of the hand. Miss Marple sat in the corner, knitting. She had asked permission to be present. Cruchot, after a glance at her mild blue eyes, had agreed. She listened, noted, said nothing. At noon the body was removed in a plain van. The knife went with it, wrapped in oilskin. Cruchot announced that no one would leave the chateau until further notice. Luncheon was a silent affair. The dining room felt cavernous without Mrs. Bryce's voice. Cécile picked at a cutlet. Leclerc drank 3 glasses of water. Dr. Moreau prescribed himself a cognac. After the meal, Miss Marple sought out Pierre in the tool shed. He was sharpening secateurs with rhythmic strokes. The knife that killed Mr. Page, was it from your store? Pierre did not look up. All knives are mine, mademoiselle, but that one was new. I keep the old ones for myself. And the footprints by the river? He paused. A woman's shoe. Not the demoiselle's. She wears riding boots. Not the English lady's. She is too heavy. Someone light. Quick. Miss Marple thanked him and returned to the house. In the afternoon, Cruchot allowed supervised walks in the East Vineyard. Miss Marple lingered by a row of Cabernet Franc. One vine had been trained upward on a wire no Frenchman would use. Thin English, picture wire, sold in Woolworths for hanging calendars. She pocketed a length. At tea, served in the petit salon, the atmosphere was funereal. Cécile announced that she would sell the vineyard after all. I cannot stay here with ghosts. Leclerc murmured that the contracts were ready. Dr. Moreau offered to accompany her to Paris for treatment. The colonel stared into his cup. Miss Marple asked mildly, Mr. Page's buyer in Chicago. Was he real? Page's luggage had been searched. Among his papers was a telegram. Offer accepted, stop shipment, urgent stop wire funds. It was signed only with initials. A.L. Cruchot pocketed it. We will trace this. That evening the house was locked and bolted. Guards patrolled the courtyard. Miss Marple, wakeful, heard the cellar door creak at 2 o'clock. She slipped downstairs in her dressing gown. A lantern glowed in the tasting vault. Someone was tapping the walls. Bricks shifted. A bottle was drawn out, examined under the light, replaced. The figure turned. Dr. Moreau, face gaunt, eyes fever-bright. He saw her and smiled with professional calm. Merely checking humidity, dear lady. Old houses breed insomnia. Miss Marple nodded. And old wines breed temptation. She returned to bed, but sleep did not come. At 4, the guards changed shift. At 5, Pierre began his rounds. At 6, the inspector assembled them in the hall. The knife that killed Page was wiped clean, but the handle bears traces of a substance, resin from the vines. The same resin is on the picture wire found in the East Vineyard. Someone planned carefully. He looked at each face in turn. And someone substituted poison for wine. The bottle opened last night contained crystals of digitalin, dissolved in the sediment. Mrs. Bryce took the first glass refilled. She was not the intended victim. Cecile gasped. Then who? Cruchot's eyes rested on her. The person who always took the first glass in this house, mademoiselle. You. The silence was absolute. Outside, the vines dripped in the morning mist, and somewhere a crow called once, like a warning. Chapter 5. The Pattern. The drawing-room at Chateau Valrose had been built for minuets and intrigues under Louis XV. It now served as a cage. The windows were shuttered against the drizzle, the fire sulked in the grate, and the 8 survivors sat in a loose circle, while Inspector Cruchot prowled like a terrier who has scented more than one rat. He began with the bottle. 12 bottles of 47 were bricked up in 1940. Yesterday we opened the wall and found 11. One had been removed and replaced with a bottle of Algerian red, the label forged. The substitution was done before the bricks were laid, during the war, or immediately after. Someone in this house knew the exact position of the true bottle, and tampered with it last night. Cecile's hand flew to her throat. Then the poison was meant for me from the beginning? Exactly. Mademoiselle, Mrs. Bryce drank your glass. Colonel Bantry's face was ashen. Good God, my ward! Cruchot turned to Pierre. You brick the wall in 1940. Who else had the key to the inner cellar? Pierre's old eyes were steady. Only the master, Monsieur Valrose. He died in 44. The key was on his chain. Yet someone entered last night. Miss Marple saw a cloaked figure at midnight. Dr. Moreau was in the cellar at 2. Moreau lit a cigarette with deliberate calm. I suffer from insomnia. The humidity readings fascinate me. Cruchot ignored him. The pruning knife that killed Page was bought by Page himself. Someone took it from his room, used it, and left it in his back. The picture wire came from England. Mr. Page's luggage contained a spool. Someone borrowed it. Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice gentle but clear. The wire was used to rig a trap. The knife was fastened to a stake with a loop. When Mr. Page bent to examine the graft, the wire snapped and the blade sprang forward. A child's toy catapult, but lethal. The killer stood behind, ready to push if the spring failed. Cruchot nodded grudgingly. The angle of the wound supports this. But who knew Page would walk in the vines at night? Page's valet, summoned from Bordeaux, produced a note found in the dead man's pocket. "Meet me at the old Cabernet Row, midnight, urgent, about the Chicago buyer." Cécile shook her head violently. "I wrote no note." The handwriting was hers, but the ink was fresh. Someone had forged it. Leclerc cleared his throat. "Mademoiselle was in the music room until 11. I heard her playing." Dr. Moreau added, "I gave her a sedative at 10:30. She could not have walked unaided." Cruchot's eyes narrowed. Then the note was a lure. Page was killed to silence him. He had discovered the substitution in the cellar. Miss Marple opened her notebook. "Mr. Page told us at dinner that he could spot a forged label by the apostrophe. He examined the bottles yesterday afternoon. He must have seen the Algerian impostor." The colonel groaned. "He said nothing to me." "He intended to," Miss Marple said. "That is why he asked for the nightcap. Someone overheard and acted first." Cruchot pounced. "Who poured the wine last night?" Pierre answered. "I drew the cork. The colonel poured." "But the glasses were already on the tray," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Bryce took the first refill. The poisoner counted on Mademoiselle Cécile's habit of taking the glass nearest the decanter. Cécile whispered, "I always do. It is childish." But Cruchot dismissed sentiment. "We have two crimes, murder by knife, murder by poison. One killer or two? The knife was wiped. The poison required knowledge of botany and access to the cellar. Dr. Moreau, you distill digitalis in your clinic." Moreau's smile was thin. "I also prescribe it. Foxgloves grow wild here. Any cook could boil the leaves." The inspector turned to Leclerc. "You handle the estate finances. The vineyard is bankrupt. If Mademoiselle dies before her majority, who inherits?" Leclerc adjusted his cuffs. "A distant cousin in Canada, but the debts would swallow the property." "Unless," Miss Marple said quietly, "the 47 is sold before the bankruptcy is declared. 12 bottles at $20,000 each would pay the creditors and leave a fortune." Leclerc paled. "Speculation, madame." Cruchot produced a ledger seized from Leclerc's room. "Entries in your hand, monsieur. Payments to a Paris account, Dr. Moreau's clinic, and withdrawals matching the cost of Algerian wine." Moreau stubbed out his cigarette. "I treat nervous patients. Fees are high." The inspector was relentless. "You both needed money. Page discovered the fraud. He had to die. Mademoiselle Cécile was the obstacle to the sale. She had to die." Cécile rose, trembling. "You would kill me for bottles of wine." Leclerc's composure cracked. "It was never meant to be murder, only to frighten you into selling. The poison was a mistake. Moreau miscalculated the dose." Moreau laughed, a high, brittle sound. "You fool! You think I miscalculate?" He lunged for the door. Cruchot's sergeant intercepted him. In the struggle, a small vial fell from Moreau's pocket, colourless crystals. "Digitalin." Cruchot snapped handcuffs on both men. "Armand Leclerc, Félix Moreau, I arrest you for the murders of Gervais Page and Lavinia Bryce, and the attempted murder of Cécile Volrose." The room exhaled. Colonel Bantry poured brandy with a shaking hand. Pierre stood motionless, tears cutting channels through the dust on his cheeks. Miss Marple closed her notebook. The pattern was always there. Greed wears the same face in Bordeaux as in much Benham. Only the vintage changes. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight glinted on the wet vines, and the forgotten vineyard looked almost hopeful. Chapter 6. The Unmasking. The tasting room beneath the west wing had been chosen for its isolation. It lay at the end of a stone passage that smelled of damp and centuries of spilled wine, and its only door was thick oak bound with iron. Inspector Cruchot had ordered the remaining 11 bottles of the 47 brought here at dawn, each cradled in straw like a sleeping child. The labels, now cleaned of cobwebs, gleamed with the faded elegance of another age. At 6 o'clock the party assembled. The storm of the previous night had blown itself out. Weak sunlight slanted through a slit window high in the wall, striking sparks from the crystal glasses Pierre had set in a solemn row. Colonel Bantry stood at the head of the table, his face carved by fatigue and relief. Cécile, pale but composed, wore a black dress that made her look older than her 19 years. Pierre hovered behind the bottles, his old hands steady for the first time in days. Cruchot entered last, carrying a small leather case. He placed it on the table with the care of a priest laying down the host. "Before we drink," he said, "we finish what was begun." He opened the case. Inside lay the pruning knife, cleaned of blood, but still bearing the faint green stain of sap. The spool of picture wire, the forged telegram, the vial of digitalin, and, newest edition, a single sheet of heavy cream notepaper, Mrs. Bryce's stationery, torn from her writing desk. Cruchot held it up. The message was written in a hurried scrawl. "Meet me in the library, 11 p.m. urgent, about Cécile." The ink was brown, the same shade Mrs. Bryce used for her endless letters to Tunbridge Wells. "Found this morning," Cruchot said, "hidden in Dr. Moreau's medical bag. He intended to plant it in Mademoiselle's room, to suggest Mrs. Bryce had lured her to the cellar and been killed by accident. A clumsy afterthought." Moreau, handcuffed between 2 gendarmes, said nothing. His eyes were bright, almost amused. Leclerc stared at the floor, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. Cruchot continued. The plan was simple. Sell the vineyard before the debts were called in. The 47 would fetch enough to silence the creditors and leave a fortune. But Page discovered the substituted bottle. He had to be removed. Mademoiselle Cécile, the legal owner, had to follow. Mrs. Bryce's death was unintended. She took the poisoned glass meant for the heiress. Colonel Bantry's voice was hoarse. "And the knife? The wire?" Miss Marple answered. "A device any schoolboy could rig. The knife was tied to a stake with the picture wire, the loop held by a twig. Mr. Page was asked to examine a rare graft, a lure using his own expertise. When he bent, the twig snapped, the wire released, the blade sprang. Dr. Moreau stood ready to finish the work if the mechanism failed. The angle of the wound proves it." She turned to Pierre. "You saw them in the cellar nights ago, moving barrels, replacing bottles. You said the vines remembered." Pierre nodded slowly. "I watched from the river path. The doctor carried the poison in his case. The lawyer counted the money in his head." Cruchot opened a second folder. Bank records from Paris. Deposits matching the sale of lesser vintages, wines never declared. And a letter from a Chicago buyer who never existed. The telegram was typed on Mr. Page's own machine, the signature forged by Leclerc. Cécile's voice was steady now. "You would have killed me for 12 bottles of wine." Leclerc looked up, his face twisted. "Not kill, frighten. The poison was to sicken you, force you to sign the sale." Moreau swore the dose was safe. When Page found the fake bottle, he threatened to expose us. We had no choice. Moreau laughed softly. "You had no stomach, Armand. I had the knife." Cruchot signalled. The gendarmes led the prisoners away. Their footsteps echoed down the passage like a funeral march. Silence settled. Colonel Bantry lifted the first bottle. "To justice," he said, and drew the cork. The wine poured dark as garnets, its scent filling the vault with violets and earth, and the memory of a perfect summer. Pierre filled the glasses with reverence. They drank. The flavour was everything legend had promised: silk and thunder, black currant and truffle, a finish that lingered like a benediction. Cécile set her glass down, untouched. "It is beautiful," she said, "but it tastes of death." Miss Marple sipped and nodded. "Wine remembers the soil, the sun, the hand that tended it, and sometimes the blood spilled for it. But the vineyard will forget. Vines are forgiving." Pierre spoke for the first time. "The bulldozers will not come. Mademoiselle will keep the land. I will teach her the pruning." Cécile looked at him, then at the Colonel, then at Miss Marple. "I will learn," she said, "and I will stay." Outside, the sun strengthened. The forgotten vineyard lay gold and bronze under the pale November sky, and the river ran clear again, carrying away the last of the storm. Chapter 7. The quiet vineyard. The police van had departed at dawn, its tires crunching over the gravel like the last notes of a discordant symphony. By 9 o'clock the chateau was silent, the kind of silence that follows a storm when even the birds seem to hold their breath. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window, watching Pierre move between the rows of vines with the slow, deliberate gait of a priest tending an altar. He carried a pair of secateurs and a coil of raffia. Each snip was precise, reverent. The vineyard, for the first time in years, looked as though it might live. Colonel Bantry knocked softly and entered without waiting. He carried 2 cups of coffee, and the air of a man who had slept little, but decided to be grateful for what remained. "They've taken the pair of them to Bordeaux," he said, handing her a cup. "Cruchot promises a full confession by luncheon. Leclerc is singing already. Moreau refuses to speak until he has a cigarette and a mirror. Extraordinary vanity in a murderer." Miss Marple accepted the coffee. "Vanity is often the last thing to die, Colonel. It comforts them when conscience fails." He leaned against the windowsill. "Cécile has asked to keep the west cave bricked up again. Not for the wine. She says the 47 can stay where it is until she is 50. A sort of penance, I think. She wants to earn the right to drink it." "A wise child," Miss Marple murmured. "Wine improves with waiting, and so do people." Below them Cécile appeared on the terrace, wrapped in an old coat of the Colonel's that reached her knees. She carried a basket and walked down the slope to join Pierre. The old man straightened, offered her the secateurs, and demonstrated the angle of the cut. She listened, head bent, then took the tool and made her first tentative snip. A single leaf fluttered to the ground like a green confession. The Colonel's eyes softened. "She'll do, Jane. She has steel in her, under all that Paris polish." "Steel is tempered by fire," Miss Marple said. "She has passed through it." They drank their coffee in companionable silence. A breeze stirred the vines. Somewhere a lark began to sing, tentative at first, then with the confidence of a creature that trusts the sky again. At 10 o'clock the Citroën returned, scrubbed clean of yesterday's mud. The driver loaded Miss Marple's modest suitcase and the knitting bag in which the beige sock had grown another inch. She descended the steps slowly, her hand on the balustrade worn smooth by generations of Valrose hands. Cécile met her in the hall. The girl's eyes were still shadowed, but the violet had deepened, as though the night had given them colour. "I do not know how to thank you, mademoiselle. You gave me back my life." Miss Marple smiled. "I merely pointed out what was already there, my dear. The rest was yours." Pierre appeared, hat in hand. He offered a small bundle, wrapped in vine leaves. "For the journey," he said gruffly. "Grapes from the row you walked. They're sweet." She took them, touched. "You will teach her well, Pierre. The vines will forgive." The old man's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "They already have." Colonel Bantry accompanied her to the car. At the door he hesitated. "You'll come back, Jane, when the first vintage is bottled under Cecile's name?" "Perhaps," she said. "One never knows. Murder has a way of following the innocent, but so does mercy." The Citroën wound down the valley, past the river now running clear, past the willows that no longer wept. The vineyard receded behind her, row upon row of gnarled stalks catching the pale sunlight like the fingers of old men raised in blessing. At Bordeaux station, she bought a ticket to Calais and a copy of the Times. The train was on time, the compartment empty. She opened the vine-leaf bundle. The grapes were black, bloomy, perfect. She ate one, slowly, letting the sweetness linger. In her notebook she wrote a final entry. Pattern complete. Greed, fear, vanity, 3 threads in every tapestry of crime. The vineyard will outlive them all. She closed the book, took up her knitting, and watched the landscape of France unroll beyond the window, hedgerows, poplars, the occasional church spire pricking the sky. The beige sock grew steadily. The train gathered speed. At Calais, the sea was calm, the packet steamer punctual. By evening she was crossing the channel under a sky the colour of pewter, the same sky that had greeted her arrival. She stood on deck, the wind tugging at her hat, and thought of Cécile bending over the vines, of Pierre's patient hands, of the 47 sleeping behind its wall of bricks. Evil, she reflected, was very dreary. One met the same motives in a chateau or a cottage, the same small, frightened hearts mistaking silence for safety. But goodness was quieter still, and it endured. The English coast appeared, a smudge of chalk and promise. Miss Marple gathered her belongings, adjusted her hat, and prepared to disembark. In Much Benham, the goldfish would be hungry. The milk on the doorstep souring gently, Mrs. Potter waiting with the key, and 100 questions. Life would resume its gentle rhythm. Tea at 4, evensong on Sundays, the slow turning of the seasons. She smiled to herself. Another small corner of the world had been set to rights, and the Dover train left in precisely 11 minutes.